He lost more Marines in Okinawa, again, in a cause worth fighting. It's not about 2,100 dead Americans in Iraq, because if this was a war worth fighting, 21,000 is not an insignificant loss. 210,000 is a loss that is heavy but must be sustained if this is a war worth fighting. But what I implored every American before we went to war to consider is this: put yourself in the shoes of a Marine Corps rifle company commander, and now write that letter home. The one that tells mom and dad, sister and brother, that their boy will no longer be celebrating Christmas or Thanksgiving or birthday. It better be one hell of a letter. It better be a letter that's more about flag, God, duty, honor. It had to be about a cause worthy of the sacrifice. And the reason why I invoke the numbers is because there's 2,125 letters that are not doing the job. This is a war that's not worth the loss of one American, because it's a war based upon a lie. If we wanted to go to war to liberate Iraq, the president should have made that case, but he didn't. He made a case only about weapons of mass destruction, and this was a case built on a lie, and there's no way the revisionists of history can undo that.
Well, as I've already, I'll stop saying this if you'll stop saying how many times you were in the Marine Corps. I'm not here to represent President Bush. I'll have to say it again. But I will have to say that occasionally one has to defend him against certain kinds of witless defamation, as that he's doing this for his daddy, or he's doing it for the profits of his friends in politics and so forth. Frivolous and flippant remarks of this kind. And as a matter of fact, in his speeches to the United Nations, he mentioned many other aspects of the crisis with Iraq, as well as weapons of mass destruction. You can look up the speeches. I'm not going to replay them for you, but they're there to be looked up. I'm sorry, though, that there's something in me that is not going to take a lot of ethical rhetoric, let alone humanist rhetoric, from someone who's just said that if he was an Iraqi, he'd prefer to live under Saddam Hussein. I haven't got over that yet.
Well, let me pose it in a different way.
Which, in other words, means you would prefer, because you aren't an Iraqi, it's as good as saying they'd be better off under Saddam Hussein. And there are implications of that, too, because American soldiers would have had to die to keep Saddam Hussein going pretty soon. After all, it was Schwarzkopf, who was willing to run the risk of losing American lives, who gave permission to Saddam Hussein to renew genocide in Iraq. American soldiers were being killed then too. American soldiers have been killed on the wrong side in the Middle East. And maybe again, the whole reason why, that's why I mentioned earlier the disgraceful refusal to indict Saddam Hussein properly, because of the past complicity. Part of the case that we have to make for regime change involves the correction, the restitution that we need to make for a previous atrocious policy and conduct, for which the Iraqi people have a long memory, even if we do not.
Not a single American life was lost from 1991 to 2003 in Iraq in combat to save the Iraqi people. Nor was a single American life lost in Rwanda to prevent 800,000 Africans from being butchered in a regime that's as abhorrent as Saddam Hussein. Let's remember, America's not here to solve the world's problems. America's here to solve its problems and figure out how it can best interact with the rest of the world. And I would advise the President and those who support this ongoing policy of aggression in Iraq to think twice about what the next step will be, because Iraq is not occurring in a vacuum, ladies and gentlemen. It's part and policy of a national security strategy of the United States published in September of 2002 that speaks of dividing the world into spheres of national interest that we, the United States, can inject ourselves unilaterally, preemptively, and militarily at our own time of choosing. This is not a policy of sound interaction. This is a policy of global imperialism that will lead to much more death and destruction.
Don't you think?
Yeah, we will.
Don't you think it's time for the?
We will in a few minutes.
Not that I don't love all your questions.
No, but I'm enraptured
some of them
by
have been
what's
jolly
going
good,
on
but,
here.
I have a feeling that a lot of people came to ask questions as well as to listen to
You got to leave?
us. No. I'm
I
saying,
don't think they have
more
to
saying
either.
bring
I
it
don't.
on. If you know what I
Ritter
mean.
looks like he's here for the duration. We'll get to it.
Okay.
I promise that Christopher is right. I want to assure everybody, assuage any doubts you might have that we're going to send you home without giving you an opportunity to unburden yourself the way we've all been doing up here. So we will do that, but I just want to get to a few things. Well, I think that maybe you should flesh out for Christopher and the people listening, Scott, what the reasons why you believe, in fact, that the Iraqi people, pardon me, I have a ham on rye, and the reasons why you feel the Iraqis were better off living under Saddam Hussein than under the American rubric.
Well, I'll base it on...
That seemed to offend Christopher, and it might have offended some other people. I heard some Twitters there.
It might offend a number of people. Let me put it into a perspective that begins in 1991 as a weapons inspector in Iraq in December, looking at a nation that's still living off of basically the fat of its former wealth, including fat, by the way, obtained through the rape and pillage of Kuwait. Baghdad was awash with Kuwaiti goods that were derived illegally, and it was enough fat to sustain Iraq into this period of economic sanctions. But I watched Iraq delve deeper and deeper and deeper into a darkness that I don't think anybody in this audience, unless you were an Iraqi living at that time, can understand. It's the darkness, not of the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, but the darkness of the tyranny of economic sanctions. Economic sanctions that were responsible for the deaths of between 700,000 and 2.2 million Iraqis. However you want to calculate it, it's a huge number. Now, I also watched an Iraq that was desperate to try and get these sanctions lifted. An Iraq that recognized that the United States would never allow these sanctions to be lifted, even if Iraq complied with its obligation to disarm. And we now know, thanks to the CIA, that Iraq did in fact disarm in the summer of 1991. It's not a debatable point. What their intents were, I don't know. I can't get into the mindset of Saddam Hussein. I can only deal with the facts. But the point is this, that the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein did whatever it took to try and get the status of Iraq away from being one of the poorest nations in the third world back on track to being a modern, technologically advanced nation. And this included oil for food sanctions violations. Not going to deny it. He stole billions of dollars from the oil for food program. But you know what? That's Iraqi oil. And he took that money, and with all due respect to the people who speak of palaces and this, I saw Iraq get better. I saw the economic life of the Iraqi people get better. I saw the roads get better. I saw Iraqi people going back into restaurants. I saw Iraqi people going into the parks. It wasn't perfect. If you spoke up against Saddam, you were arrested, but I saw things improve. I'm not here to defend the nature of the regime. I'm making a statement that in January of 2003, you could walk the streets of Baghdad without fear of being stopped by an American patrol.
Yeah, that's true.
In January 2003, you could go to sleep at night without having to worry about your door being kicked down and dragged off by Americans to a prison run by Americans where you would be tortured by Americans. And an American, I'm deeply offended by this. We don't do this sort of thing, and yet because we have operated in violation of the rule of law going into Iraq, we operate in violation of the rule of law in the occupation of Iraq.
Christopher, what were your feelings throughout the long haul of the Clinton administration and on into the early months of the Bush administration with respect to the imposition of sanctions? And Madeleine Albright's assertion that it's worth the deaths, I think she said something to the effect that
500,000.
It's worth the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children.
That was the Leslie Stahl estimate, I think.
Yeah.
Madeleine Albright's a fool, but nothing she can do about it. But what she meant is, whatever the figure is, yeah, we think it's worth. That's more or less true.
Right.
I reasoned it when I could for myself, and whenever I could, which was not infrequently. I asked my Iraqi and Kurdish friends what they thought about it. And they said, well, look, it's terrible, and all our families are suffering very badly. But if the sanctions were lifted, there's no doubt that the surplus would go to try and rebuild weapons of mass destruction and to strengthen the regime, which is already profiting, ironically enough, from the sanctions themselves. In other words, it was like a prisoner's dilemma.